back again, coding in the kitchen. I've been working on some stuff over the last week or two. There's actually a continuation of stuff I've been doing for ages and ages and ages, like since I was a kid, of really simple geometric shapes in really simple colors, which I love. And I keep coming back to this, drawing it in notebooks, and I thought I'd just program it up again for like the millionth time. So this is what I built. Made a couple of really simple things, new project in openFrameworks. I set up a couple of variables for a width and a height, and I'm going to build a landscape out of boxes. And I keep coming back to boxes and simple geometric shapes, and I don't know why, but it's a thing. And this week's version of that thing that I keep coming back to looks like this. So it's a really, really simple grid form that I've built using openFrameworks. It's an array of boxes, width and height, that are all in order, that are just aligned with a random variation in height. And the simplicity is breathtaking, but I love it. I absolutely love it. And what I'm basically doing is, if I walk through the code a little bit here, let me make the code slightly larger and you can see. I set up my app. I've set some variables for width and height of how many blocks by how many blocks I want. So to make it super simple, I'm just going to set this to be 20 by 20. I'm saying the basic box size is 1 and the maximum height it can be is 8. I've set some booleans for if I want to automatically rotate this, because I'd like to be able to see the camera automatically rotating. Later on I'm going to march it, so I'm going to actually get the kind of landscape flying. So I set up these booleans and set them to be false. And then, because I'm in 3D, I make in my header, you can see I've made an easy cam called cam and an OF light point called light, and I set my light to be a point light, set its position. I switch on depth test, which is a thing in openFrameworks to make sure that it renders in 3D rather than the order that things are drawn. So if your 3D looks a bit weird, enable depth test, and it means that 3D represented stuff will be ordered in the Z axis rather than by the order it appears to be drawn in the program. And then on my draw routine, I enable the light, I enable the camera, and I just go through this pair of loops, one inside the other, going through Z equals 0 up to the depth, and then the width. So I'm drawing a line at a time of boxes. And to put the boxes in the right position, I'm just counting across and across and across and across in these lines. And I use push matrix and then translate to, depending upon how big the boxes are, how many points across, minus halfway, so the middle of my rectangle or landscape is 0. And then I'm just counting across and then down to translate in X and Y. I'm not translating at all. That's why the middle is 0. And then Z, I'm taking my 2 integers from these loops and using it to set the X position times the size of the box minus half the width. Z position times the size of the box minus half the depth. So it just counts up and across. And then I'm using really super simple OF draw box and drawing it at 0, because we've translated the screen around, to whatever I said the size of the box should be, width and height. And I pop the matrix. And then at the end, I'm just doing this debug to draw the frame rate. And then in my key pressed, I've put this bunch of standard stuff. I did a video about adding key press things into standard routine for your standard template if you want. Toggle full screen, and then if I press R, it flips the Boolean for rotating, it flips the Boolean for marching. When I run my code, here I've just reduced it to 20 by 20. And you can see I have this grid, 20 cubes by 20 cubes, and I'm just playing with the height of the cubes. And I really like that. That's properly doing something for me. I like that it's not soft. I like that it's monochromatic. I like that it's super simple. And as I started building more, I made it bigger and bigger and bigger. Herein comes an interesting thing. As I was starting to code this, I got up to making, here we go, 200 boxes by 400 boxes, which is 80,000 boxes. And I was building boxes by using OF box primitive. And at about 250,000 boxes, stuff started getting a bit slow, and I started investigating what's going on, and looking at how to move things onto the GPU and so on. So I got my array of 250,000 boxes, and it started getting super slow. And I was investigating lots of different ways to deal with this. So I've just gone through one of the simplest ways, which is using OF drawbox. I was using OF box primitives before, and then using vertex buffer objects and looking at where the slowdown was in moving these objects that were on the CPU, which need to get moved to the GPU and rendered on the GPU. And if you push everything onto the GPU and then manipulate it on the GPU, it's much faster. But this was pushing 250,000 objects every frame. And anyway, we won't go there. I'll fix it in another video, maybe. But I built this, and I've got the EasyCam object, so I can go and have a look at it, and it's sort of doing all the things that I like. But what I want to do is make this march like a landscape. So what I need to do is remember the height of each of the objects, and either move that object back or just make the objects behind that height, and then on the very front edge make a completely new line and keep flowing them. So the back line will keep being erased and all of the other lines will be moved back. So I need to remember these heights. So I set up a vector of, ended up being 250,000 objects. And then I realized every time I'm deleting the last object in the vector and adding one at the front, it's shuffling the whole vector. So I investigated how to do this, and I spoke with a friend of mine, and a couple of other people said, oh, use a ring buffer. And so I built a ring buffer, which is basically taking a vector, like a straight array, and pretending that it's circular. And so I built a little routine in my header file to make, first of all, a buffer that I could put meshes into. So we've got this class, and you set it up and you say, how big is this ring buffer going to be? And when you want to put something into the ring buffer, you use a function called push, whatever you want into the buffer. And then when you want to pull something from it, you just ask to pull it. And inside the buffer, it keeps an index of where it thinks it is now, as if it were a ring, but actually it's just going to the end and starting again and again and again. But it means that rather than destroying the last element and adding a new one, and all the time you're taking off the end and pushing on the beginning, which shuffles the whole thing, you're just overwriting one as you go through based upon where the index is, as if it were a ring. So I thought that was super fancy, and I wrote it, and there's a bunch of different ways to write it, and it didn't seem to get any faster, but I'd got a fancy ring buffer, which I was very happy about. So I set that up. You could do it with a standard array or a vector. But what I wanted to do was make the landscape march. When I hit the M key in my key press routine, I set this Boolean be march to true. And then in my update, I've got this routine. So if I've told it to march, I just get one loop here that goes through the width, because we're only doing one line. And I count through the width and make a box, and then I set the height to be random, which is exactly what I did when I started up, and I use this ring buffer routine called push, and I push onto the ring buffer. If this was a vector, I just push back and it would allow me to erase the beginning and delete the end. But it means that when I render it, it's just going to render from wherever it wants. So in my draw routine, when I'm going across the width and the height, when I use draw box, I'm saying go to this ring buffer and get me wherever the index is and count from what it thinks is the beginning of this sort of pretend ring. What it looks like is this. So here is my mesh, and I hit M, and you can see it starts marching, which I really like. And that was great. And I've got the easy cam in, so I can go and have a look at it and move it around and stuff like that. And as I got this marching, you can see there it is, marching away, which I really, really liked. Actually, I wanted some variation. So in my update routine where I'm saying, make me a new line, I added this little routine in the middle. So inside where we're going from one edge of the back to the other edge of the back, making new boxes across this scape width variable, I'm saying if the random of 10 is less than 9.5, i.e. 95% of the time, just make the height of the new box that you're making at this point within my maximum height range, which is a variable that I set up here. But if not, what I want to do is, actually I'm going to do something a little bit funky, because I built this and I run through the code and I've spent hours and hours watching it, and everything was kind of like very uniform randomness, if that makes sense. And I wanted some more variation. So I'm saying 5% of the time, 1 in every 20 blocks that you're making, make it taller. Go max height times a certain amount. And it was sort of uniformly random. But I wanted variation over time. So I'm using OF noise, Perlin noise, driven by the system time. So I'm saying, make me every 5%, make me a much taller block, depending upon what's happening in this streaky, lumpy, smooth randomness from the Perlin noise. And then give me a feed from whatever the time is now, the system time in milliseconds divided by 1,000. So we're feeding in values, it's divided by 10,000, feeding in values every 10 seconds to change this. So this is going to, from OF noise, is going to give me a value from -1 to +1, I think. I can't remember, somebody will correct me. And then I'm multiplying that by the max height, so I can get very tall or very short. And this gives me this randomness of additional height that'll change slowly over time. And it looks a little bit like this. So I have my landscape. I'm going to run it full screen. I tell it to start marching, and you can see where it's making my new boxes at the back edge. every 5% or so, it's making much taller ones. And there's a variation within that above the standard height, which is within this random 0 to 8 range. And we have these much higher ones. But because we're feeding it in the Perlin noise, that range of extra randomness starts to give us this kind of slow progression of randomness to interlinked randomness, which I thought was just fantastic. And you can see it kind of, I don't know that it's sculptural or landscape or terrain or something, but I love the starkness, the monochromatic nature, the angular nature of it, and I love the regularity. There's something else that I wanted to do, is that actually I want to break up this quite rigid grid. I like the grid, but I don't like the rigidity of the alignment. So in my draw routine, when I'm doing this translation, I also said translate around the y-axis. So as I move my translation to where I'm going to put a box, I'm also going to rotate. So the boxes themselves are going to be rotated slightly. So they're all in the same position, but rather than being a cube and a cube and a cube, it'll be a cube slightly rotated, cube slightly rotated, cube slightly rotated, and so on. So we get more of an organic, less ordered feel. And you can see this in the grid here, in that it's still gridded, but we have this variation in the rotation of all of the items. What's interesting, when we start to march, actually, the boxes have this very subtle, slow turning over time. As they march, they're spinning in place, which I'm really enjoying too. And we get this random height that's being driven by Perlin noise. So we're starting to get, for me, something that feels really, really exciting. So you can see what's going on, where at the back edge, we're continually making one new line. And then we're using this ring buffer just to keep the information about what heights things should be as they march forward. And at the other end, we're just deleting those objects one at a time. And this did kind of everything that I wanted. I started exploring a bit more, and I started doing more rotations. So when we're drawing in our main draw loop, and we're doing this push matrix, pop matrix to freeze, and then move to where we want to put the boxes, I started putting Z rotations in as well, and it started getting somewhere different. You can see this is the same landscape, box landscape. And if I tell it to march, you can see this rotation. But not only am I rotating in the y-axis, I'm rotating in the z-axis, which gives this folding motion, almost like fur. And now we start to get the variation coming through. Of our Perlin noise driven, taller, overlying landscape. We started doing something, I'm not sure whether I like it, but it's in there. It's a little too soft, it's a little too hair-like, it's a little too organic. I found a lot of places where I could explore. The last thing that I did is, because I was starting to find views as I was moving the camera around that I liked, I wanted to save where I'd move the camera position to. So I added an openFrameworks add-on called OF Camera Save Load. And what that allows you to do is, when I press the S key, it fires a command to this add-on saying grab the camera position and save it. And it saves a text file into my data folder under whatever name you like. And this is called camera position. And I could name it camera position 1, camera position 2, and so on. And in my startup, I've also added a function OF load camera to load in the camera data into my EasyCam object that I've called cam, the file camera position. So when I hit the S key, it'll save the camera, and when I load this up later, it'll automatically reload that. And if I wanted, I could add this to choose multiple camera positions and so on, so I can, you know, do a top, left, right, whatever else I like. But I quite like that because I could find a particular viewpoint that I liked, which was this exact one. And run it marching. And I've got to be honest and say, I have sat and watched this for hours. And it's super simple, but it's doing a bunch of things that I really like. And I was looking at how to export this as polylines and plot it. And I think maybe I'll do some prints. But I think I'm going to record like a 2-hour version of this and maybe put it on YouTube. And if you like it, you can just sit and watch it. And maybe I'll port this to a Raspberry Pi, which means I can just turn it into a painting and hang it on the wall. And I started doing a whole load of drawings, and I think this is possibly part of an incorrectly or inaccurately named 100 Views of Tokyo. But that might also be called 100 Views of Neukölln. And I was looking at some of the etchings from Hiroshige. I'm looking at the color palettes and thinking what I might want to do next. But for now, I'm going to leave it there. This is where I've been going with what might be called 100 Views of Neukölln, exploring block randomness landscape with Perlin noise, simplicity, black and white rotation, and making more code in the kitchen. I hope you like what's going on. Leave me some comments. Tell me what you're building. Hit the subscribe button, and I will see you on another video. Thanks very much.